Life is cruel.
Last time, we went over why Infrared was wrong about his understanding of Griffin's definition of fascism, and why, despite his assertions, it's useful for discovering the core ideological component of fascism. Here we will go over the central claim of Haas's video that Dugin isn't a fascist.
We can completely dismiss outright that he's somehow a fascist or a Nazi.
Now, this can be broken down into three reasons that Bing has identified as the basis for Haas's defense of the claim. 1. Because the two sources that tie him to the European New Right are the German Conservative Revolution and the traditionalism of Evola and Guénon, which aren't fascist themselves.
The two main things that unite Dugin with the European New Right isn't fascism or Nazism whatsoever. It's the German Conservative Revolution and traditionalism more broadly. Now, the German Conservative Revolution isn't synonymous with Nazism. It predated Nazism, and while many of the German Conservative Revolution intellectuals and philosophers saw Nazism as the zeitgeist of their intellectual movement, most of them would later come to see this as a misstep. They also had some pretty severe disagreements with the Nazis, such as a complete rejection of their notion of racialism or biological races. They saw this as an Anglo-Saxon perversion that had nothing to do with the German cultural tradition. The main thrust of the German Conservative Revolution movement was basically a skepticism of both Anglo-Saxon liberalism and what they conceived to be Bolshevik communism, filtered through the works of Western Marxists like Lukács. Now, in the case of traditionalism, you're dealing with thinkers like René Guénon and later people like Julius Evola. And the basic thrust of their thinking is that with the rise of Western modernity, rationalistic modernity, these more esoteric, hidden, and intuitive insights of the world's religions, traditions, and spiritualities have been forgotten and lost, and we need to establish a new connection with them by establishing a form of thinking that is outside of the bounds of the rationalistic, modern thinking of the West.
For the sake of time, we're only focusing on a few figures from these. Going through all the Revcons, pre- and post-war, would require a multi-hour video, and Avola's traditionalism is far more relevant here than Guénon's spiritual lyrical individual journey through space, time, Hinduism, and Islam. 2. Dugin isn't fascist because, in Fascism, Borderless, and Red, he uses the term fascism as an ironic ploy to describe a different form of politics. And he isn't sincerely crafting a Russian form of fascism here.
Now, the name is quite incriminating. The title by Dugin is meant to be inherently ironic. Fascism isn't borderless, and it's certainly not red, at least in terms of its historical experience. But Dugin is using this as a kind of ironic ploy and play on words to give expression to an entirely different conception of a Russian politics. So he's just using the word fascism to describe something that's neither the Soviet version of communism nor Western liberalism. And if you actually read the text, that word has nothing to do with its actual, real, historical reality. Something he pretty much acknowledges even in that piece. Now, I need to emphasize that even in this specific time period, Dugin was not a Nazi.
3. He includes ethnic and religious minorities instead of advocating for their genocide, unlike Nazism, thus defining fascism as inherently exclusive to a single ethnic or racial group.
The idea of the unification of a territory or a country on the basis of the recognition of difference might seem alien to us as Westerners. We have the idea of the nation state, where unity is only based on sameness. But the historical Asiatic land empires were different. They created vast territorial unities precisely on the basis of the recognition of the differences between peoples and the ways in which those different peoples come to interact in a determinate manner. So just on that basis alone, we can completely dismiss outright, without even having to go any further into Dugin's work, that he's somehow a fascist or a Nazi. The Nazis and fascists believed in the nation state, the modern nation state. They believed in the idea of a hierarchy of peoples and a hierarchy of nations and a hierarchy of races. This is completely antithetical to Dugin's worldview, which is inclusive and multipolar. The Eurasian movement had nothing to do with the actual neo-Nazi, ultra-nationalist or ethno-nationalist skinheads who were, anti-Muslim and anti-immigrant, and they were racist and they were thugs. I mean, the Eurasian movement had nothing to do with that. For them, the third position confined its significance to trying to discover a uniquely anti-imperialist Russian form of politics, one that would be inclusive of all of Russia's ethnic minorities and minority religions. Their traditionalism wanted to integrate all of the traditions of Russia, not just Orthodox Christianity and the Russian ethnicity, but everyone who was part, historically, of the multi-ethnic and multi-religious Russian civilization.
Note, we will also counter the notion in 1 that these are Dugin's main 2 influences, given Benoist's major influence on him, and how that'll be useful for countering the other reasons. So let's start with 1 and go from there. And hopefully by the end of this, we will have countered all the main reasons Haas tries to deny Dugin's fascist credentials.
You are not anymore boss.
Originating in France with its principal think tank, Greece, Group for Research and Studies on European Civilization, of which Alain de Benoist was a founding member, it widened out to Europe as a whole. Over the decades, the ENR has come to develop the general philosophy of opposing multicultural liberal modernity and favoring a new world of ethnopluralism, spreading their ideas through a type of metapolitics to try and achieve cultural hegemony. This means operating outside the arena of party political life in order to concentrate on using intellectual and artistic production to overcome the forces of materialism and the degenerative ethnic and cultural panmixy, miscegenation, and the general spiritual chaos of modernity. The ultimate aim is to preserve diversity in ethnic and cultural difference so that a new form of politics will arise to defend them. We will further explain the ideas of ethnopluralism when we get into one of ENR's main theorists, Alain de Benoist, as well as what connection the German conservative revolutionaries have to them. While it's true that the German conservative revolutionaries did reject liberal modernity, the socialist alternative, and also the conservatism of Wilhelmianism, and grew independently of and had a varied relationship with Nazism, its core, conservative revolution was, as being, we'll argue, a form of fascism, or proto-fascism, depending on the specific thinker. Roger Griffin illustrates its core of ultranational rebirth when going over one of their principal philosophers, Moeller von den Bruck's concept of reconnection forwards, and how it relates to the Nazis and other philosophies in its description of reconnection. With the most ancient strata of human wisdom and belief interred by modernity, and then taking these past properties and retaining whatever was healthy or redeemable of the present in a new ideological synthesis with what could be retrieved from the mythic greatness of the past and the creation of a new nomos and community. The term conservative, then, in revolutionary conservatism, refers to conserving the eternal, vital, and healthy properties of the organic nation by reconnecting with them from the past and present, and then crafting a new national community from those roots, thereby renewing the people with a new revolutionary form and future, hence the revolutionary part of the term. Bruck then viewed Marxian socialism as an ungrounded mechanical internationalism that lacked an organic blueprint or basis to keep it rooted. So this type of socialism, from his view, blindly went forward into death. He didn't hate Marxism because of some Western Marxists, as Haas claims.
The main thrust of the German conservative revolution movement was basically a skepticism of both Anglo-Saxon liberalism and what they conceived to be Bolshevik communism, filtered through the works of Western Marxists like Lukács.
Rather, Bruck in Germany's Third Empire, the title was an inspiration for the Nazis' Third Reich, critiques Marx as having no roots in the past, and also saying, as a Jew, he had no country, and that there needed to be a German National Socialism to set about making good the mischief he effected.
Filtered through the works of Western Marxists like Lukács.
The German conservative revolutionaries then rejected the reactionary conservatism of Wilhelmianism for its perceived qualities of impotence and backwardness, as its attachment to reviving the old monarchy meant for them that it wouldn't do what needed to be done to save the eternality of the nation from degeneration. Dugin, in his book, Fourth Political Theory, expresses this similar criticism for non-revolutionary conservatives by telling them that in order to heal the sickness of a metaphorically dying person, you cannot merely go back to the past from which the sickness or its elements arose. He says that conservative revolutionaries tell conservative fundamentalists who try to heal this sick man with this past that you offer to return to a condition when man exhibited only the first symptoms of illness, when there first began the hacking cough. Today this man lies dying, but you speak of how good things were for him earlier. You contrast a coughing man with a dying one, but you want to dig down to discover from whence came the infection and why he started to cough. The fact that in coughing he does not die, but goes to work, does not convince us that he is whole and healthy. Somewhere that virus must have nested even earlier. Dugin further goes on to explain that this sickness of modernity isn't bound to the present. It is not merely today's sickness in the repudiated present, it is a disclosure in today's world of that which yesterday's world prepared for it, so precious for traditionalists. Modernity does not become better for this, and tradition, meanwhile, loses its unequivocal positivity. In order to save any positive aspects of tradition, requires revolution, to provide closure in a new world from existing modernity's open aimlessness, not try and provide this closure from only the past, which would simply restart the sickness. It's also worth noting that Dugin himself identified the conservative revolution with fascism when talking about its syncretic nature in his infamous 1997 essay, Fascism, Borderless, and Red. It is absolutely unjustified to call fascism an extremely right-wing ideology. This phenomenon is much more precisely characterized with the paradoxical formula, conservative revolution. We will return to this essay later on. Avola's traditionalism refers to the ancient traditions, wisdoms, and even spiritual racism that have been lost in the modern world's age of vice and must be uncovered. However, instead of immediately striking at the tiger that is modernity, one must instead ride it, learn to harness and adapt to the chaotic forces of modernity, and then, when it becomes exhausted, strike at it. Hence his usage of the Far Eastern metaphor of riding the tiger, which says that a ferocious tiger will destroy everything in its path. The best strategy, then, is to climb on top of it until it exhausts itself, thereby allowing you the opportunity to kill it. Avola invokes his own reconnection forwards by seeking to renew this eternal order of traditions and a new national community rooted in their uncovered properties, wielded by a new elite of warrior priests that will not only strike the exhausted beast, but usher in a new era of traditional society. Dugin identifies with the conservative revolution and Avola's use of tradition as a positive, ancient, eternal, and timeless force because, like him, they oppose the existing modernity, and like them, he seeks his own reconnection forwards with an organic essence and its traditions into a new world. Dugin does have disagreements with Avola, namely that he views his politics as focusing too much on returning to a golden past, hence categorizing Avola as a fundamentalist conservative. Dugin does see this traditional past as important, but it must be synthesized with other things, namely Bruck's revolutionary drive, which will not only pull down the existing structure or rekindle the past, but also drive forth a new time. Dugin's connection to the European New Right doesn't adhere despite Infrared's claim, as he takes key inspiration from other figures, such as French New Rightists Alain de Benoist, both of whom have had many exchanges with each other. Benoist also belongs to the post-war generation of revolutionary conservatives that emerged after and in inspiration from German New Right theorist and Ernst Junger's secretary, Armin Moeller, who wrote Conservative Revolution in Germany, 1918 to 1932 in 1950, which sought to revive the ideology. Dugin's identification with the conservative revolution should be put into the context of its attachment to this development of it, not merely to its original ideologues. Benoist is a key thinker in developing ethnopluralism, or ethno-differentiationalism, in the French and broader European New Right. Beings referenced this term a few times before, but to summarize the concept, it seeks to preserve the unique biological and cultural differences between different peoples through creating separate ethnocultural regions. This is further developed by other fascists within different trends, such as separating these ethnocultural regions through the formation of ethnostates, stateless national communities, or civilizational states rooted in a people's ethnos. All of these variations on ethnopluralism hope to replace the existing world system of liberal nation-states. Dugin directly references Benoist in Fourth Political Theory a number of times, and particularly here, where ethnopluralism is used as an important part of his multipolar world. Instead of a unipolar world, the fourth political theory insists upon a multipolar world, and instead of universalism, on pluriversalism, which Alain de Benoist brilliantly pointed out in his book. Benoist particularly pairs his ethnopluralism with the principle of empire or imperial idea, which Dugin has also taken inspiration from. To summarize this concept, Bing will bounce off a quote from Benoist himself in The Idea of Empire. The principle of empire tries to reconcile the one and the many, the particular and the universal. Its general law is that of autonomy and the respect for diversity. The empire tries to unify on a higher level without suppressing the diversity of cultures, ethnic characters, and peoples. It is a whole whose parts are autonomous in proportion to the solidity of what unites them. These parts are differentiated and organic, in contrast to the unitary and centralized societies of the national kingdom. The empire embodies the classical image of universities. Moeller von den Bruck rightly saw the empire as a unity of opposites, while Evola defined it as a supranational organization such that its unity does not tend to destroy or to level the ethnic and cultural multiplicity it embraces, adding that the imperial principle makes it possible to retreat from the multiplicity of diverse elements to a principle which is at once higher and prior to their differentiation, a differentiation which proceeds only from a sensible reality. So it is not a question of abolishing, but of integrating differences. To summarize and further go on from here, Benoist conceives of using an empire as a political entity that houses many different cultural identities under transcendent principles that preserves their organic differences, rather than nation-statism, which Benoist sees as antithetical and hostile to these differences, by promoting and enforcing a homogenizing entity over the whole population. This is just one example of many post-war fascists who reject the nation-state and the liberal conception of nationalism. Dugin synthesizes this into his conception of ethnos, which has influences from those outside of the ENR, such as 20th century Soviet ethnologist and Eurasianist Lev Gumilev, whose own ethnos theory regards the Russian people as a super-ethnos, created from a synthesis of Slavic, Mongol, Tartar, Finno-Uric, and other smaller ethnic groups, which Dugin uses to imagine his Eurasian empire as a Russian-led entity.
Question of who rules the world.
To quickly note here, Benoist, Evola, and Gumilev aren't Dugin's brain, and the same is true of him being Putin's brain, as some journalists have tried to claim. Merely taking influence from right-wingers isn't what makes Dugin a fascist. Haas is correct in saying this, but how he synthesizes and incorporates these ideas is how we've detected his inclusion in the political phenomena. To quote from Shekhovtov, whose research on Dugin is most helpful, when investigating Dugin's ideas of ethnos and his flavor of NEO-EURASIANISm, it reveals to us its more sinister underpinnings and implications. NEO-EURASIANISm refers to Eurasia rather than Europe. Dugin advances the idea of positive ethnic pluralism, a project focused on keeping a positive or at least zero-sum demographic balance to prevent the disappearance of Eurasian ethnic communities. It is precisely the idea of this project that explains the need for politically divided Eurasia to give way to a federal Eurasian empire led spiritually by the Russian Federation. All political frontiers are expected to be abolished in favor of new, natural, organic ethnic borders. Dugin asserts that these borders do not imply the political domination of one ethnic community over the other. However, they inherently lead to the appearance of ethnocultural ghettos. In the terms of Neo-Eurasianism, this is called an organic cultural ethnic process, intended to create individual national realities for the Russians, as well as for Tartars, Chechens, Armenians, and the rest. So while Dugin may not explicitly call for genocide, he still advocates for the forced assimilation of these groups under this empire. This has many implications and consequences that could easily lead to mass incarceration, murder, and indoctrination, especially for those who are resistant to this political vision and its authorities. Dugin uses the language of ethnic self-determination, but for those who can see past these gestures of universal difference and cultural autonomy, you can start to see where the sources of exclusionism emerge. One of the many ways that certain post-war fascists have tried to escape the marginalization of fascism is to disconnect themselves from the infamous interwar permutations of Italian fascism and Nazism, and then connect themselves to other groups that retain the same palingenetic ultranationalist core, such as the revolutionary conservatives. This way, the fascism they build will be diversified from those past permutations and manifested into a new one. They will also define fascism in a purposefully interwar-specific way so that their differences from them will make them seem as if they don't belong to the same political ideology. This doesn't mean they aren't genuinely different or may not sincerely believe they are different from the Nazis and Italian fascists. They have developed something new, and some are sure of their non-fascist credentials. However, they aren't so different as to belong to something other than fascism as we've defined it. The way to connect two separate permutations under the same political ideology requires identifying a core component that we can draw on that allows us to understand how these two are connected, as well as how they are able to differentiate themselves from their counterparts. So for being the core component of fascism, as we've gone through plenty times before, is a paleogenetic form of populist ultranationalism. From this, we can both connect and separate people like Dugin from Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini and so on. Certainly, Hitler and Dugin, for example, belong to very different permutations, so trying to frame him as the next Hitler, or as some sign that the Russian Federation is undergoing a crisis similar to that of Weimar Germany, would certainly be a case of reducing the nuances of history. So the argument here isn't Dugin is Hitler or that he's a German Nazi, but rather that he expresses a politics that we've come to classify as one of many variations of generic fascism. The generic phenomenon of fascism can exist outside of Nazism's racial determinism and outright genocidal language because it has full autonomy and shouldn't be reduced to an agent of capital that can only manifest as Western imperial racism. Russians, for example, are completely capable of creating their own forms of fascism, conservatism, liberalism, and so on, all tied to their own conditions and personal particularities. Dugin didn't just stumble and fall into a series of misplaced rakes, wherein he oopsie-doopsied his way into identifying with fascism in the 90s. He was completely aware and dare being, say, quite educated of what fascism was. To quote him twice directly from Fascism, Borderless, and Red, fascism, this is a nationalism, yet not any nationalism, but a revolutionary, rebellious, romantic, idealistic form of nationalism, appealing to a great myth and transcendental idea, trying to put into practice the impossible dream, to give birth to a society of the hero and superhuman, to change and transform the world. And then here he makes a direct distinction between fascism and the national capitalism, which some Marxists have tried to paint fascism as. Fascism despises everything that makes up the essence of national capitalism. He fights for the domination of national idealism and not national capital, and against the bourgeoisie and intelligentsia, and not for her and not with her. The fascist pathos is accurately defined in the famous phrase of Mussolini, "Rise, fascist and proletarian Italy, fascist and proletarian." Such is the orientation of fascism. It is a labor and heroic, militant and creative, idealistic and futuristic ideology which does not have anything in common with securing additional government comfort for the traitors, even if 1,000 times national, and sinecures for the socially parasitic intelligentsia. Although today's Dugin will deny his fascist credentials and claim to have broken off and transcended them, as well as the other modernist political ideologies, to form a fourth way, he still expresses the ideological core. He seeks to rebirth the Eurasian ethnos into a civilizational state or empire that will reconnect the Eurasian people with their ancient wisdoms, traditions, values, and norms. This encapsulates a version of the revolutionary conservative notion of a reconnection forwards. As mentioned before, Dugin uses Benoist's ethnopluralism as an influence to develop this new world further by seeing a sense of solidarity with other people's struggles to form their own civilizational state that will rebirth their respective ethnos. All of this is to rebel against and replace the existing modernity of Atlanticist-controlled and dominated liberal capitalism with a form of rooted modernity, even if he claims himself to be anti-modern, where nation-states are replaced with ethno-plural civilizational states. Thereby, this new society is re-rooted in the vitality and internal wisdom of its past to unlock the creativity and strength of all those within, creating a new era of grounded forward momentum, not unlike the rooted modernities that both Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy were trying to create in their own ways. We've been teasing out the infamous 90s essay, but here we should properly go over it to finally close out the third part of countering this whole claim that Dugin isn't a fascist. To summarize Fascism, Borderless, and Red, Dugin argues that the reason Hitler and Mussolini failed to bring about the fascist revolution was due to their rejection of the Soviet Union and alliances with capitalist and conservative forces. And if Russia is to have fascism, as it has already experienced the first two ideological phases of liberalism, first position, and communism, second position, it should be done through a form of fascism, third position, that can avoid national capitalism by embracing a more authentically revolutionary form of national socialism that won't accept any such alliances. It's important to remember that during the 90s, there was a lot of talk of Russia transitioning from a communist state to a nationalist and fascist one. And for Dugin, this was seen as it transitioning to not really a fascism, but an inauthentic form of it, which plagued the earlier fascisms of Mussolini and Hitler. As Dugin sees it, the use of socialism and National Socialism has an ethnic specification, basically socialism but for ethnicity, in this case the Russian one, because it takes into account and serves their national organicism, which makes up its traditions, ethics, and cohesion. Thereby, this National Socialism will be more rural, communal, regionalistic, and cooperative. His views from the 90s, in essence, haven't changed much to the degree of him somehow becoming non-fascist. He just claims, as does those within the European New Right, that they aren't fascist because they don't subscribe to outright genocide, nation-statism, and so on. But when it comes to the core mission of revolutionary ultranational rebirth, it's still very much there. So yes, Dugin is a fascist. His worldview may be complicated and draw on many different influences, but it's precisely how he wields and synthesizes them that makes him count. Again, Haas is correct to say that merely taking influences from a fascist or far-righter does inherently make that person a fascist or far-right. However, it's precisely what they do with those influences that should be how we conclude the consequences of them, and if it falls into one category or the other. Wow! Pew, pew! The only store where you can buy shoes for... You ever looked at your snake and went, hey, you get one shoe, get the second one half off. Please, I cannot feed my family